Hola a todos. Welcome to our event this afternoon, Activism Across the Territories. I'd like to introduce our two speakers today. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Tiara Na'puti, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Global and International Studies at the School of Social Sciences at the University of California-Irvine. She's a Chamorro scholar from Guåhan, Guam. Her research focuses on issues of indigenous movements, colonialism, and militarism in the Mariana Islands archipelago. In 2021 and 2022, she was the recipient of a Mellon ACLS Scholars in Society Fellowship, which she used to work with independent Guåhan educating the island's public about sovereignty. Dr. Na'puti's recent publications appear in Security Dialogue, Environmental Communication, and Communication and Critical Cultural Studies. She has also published in outlets such as Common Dreams, In These Times, Pacific Island Times, and Latinx Spaces. Moderating this conversation is Ed Morales, who is a Mellon Bridging the Divides Fellow at Centro. He is an author and journalist who writes regularly for The Nation, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and CNN Opinions. He was staff writer at The Village Voice and columnist at Newsday. He is the author of Fantasy Island, Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico, Latinx, The New Force in Politics and Culture, and The Latin Beat, From Rumba to Rock, and Living in Spanglish. He is also a lecturer at Columbia University's Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. And with that, I will turn the conversation over to Ed and Tiara.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to let Tiara make a brief presentation. I'm really excited to hear about the part of the world that Guåhan is in and the parallels that are with other territories of the United States. So I'm going to give the floor to you now, Tiara.
Okay, buenas and half a day. I'm going to share my screen briefly. So let me get started with that. Yeah, so it's great to be here with you this afternoon, this morning. I wanted to open and begin and situate the places and people that I'm speaking to and pay my respects as a genuine attempt to understand where we're meeting. This is part of an opening and an obligation to think about where I am as a visitor in this place and on these lands. I'm zooming in with you today from the area called Tongvar, which is the unceded territories and lands of the Tongva and the Hashiman peoples. Tongvar means our world, and that refers to a really expansive place that's here in Southern California. And these are cared for and sacred lands that continue to be protected by the indigenous peoples. And so I wanted to start by saying thank you and to recognize the place where I'm at. And also to thank you all for being here today, and to CUNY and the Center for Puerto Rican Studies for the invitation. On this slide here is an image, a couple of images that they both represent Fua Bay or Fua Rock, which is in the background. That's the site of our creation story in Guåhan. And that is the indigenous place name of our island, otherwise known as Guam. There's a mural as well across there that was painted by some of our activist communities to tell of our creation story. And it just so happens that there are 4 women who are pregnant at the time of this photo is taken, honoring our ancestors in the site of our creation story. So I thought we'd begin in a good way with this imagery, especially because I want to talk a little bit about the issues going on in Guåhan in terms of activism and sovereignty. Oh, and here's my contact information. I thought I'd share that as well. And I'm happy to follow up with folks after the Q&A or in other ways. You can reach me at my work email that's displayed here. So we are the people of Micronesia, and we try to reach out and forge deep relationships from our home and our place and with others who may be situated here and there. In doing so, it's important to think about genuine security, which is a an issue that I wanted to talk about as I display these images here of peoples in our homeland, advocating for the protection of our native lands and the protection of our peoples as Chamorro peoples. When we think about genuine security, it's a topic or an issue, a term that really talks about islands and our different perspectives across archipelagos. So thinking about a global approach to issues like countering militarism, and an organization that I have been privileged to work with over the years is called the International Women's Network Against Militarism. And they have theorized a world of genuine security. And so in thinking about the issues that we're facing in terms of militarism, genuine security is a concept that helps us kind of orient to some of the activism happening on the ground in different places across different islands and archipelagos. And so I want to share this map here because one of the things that's so important when we're talking about sovereignty, when we're talking about climate change, is to really actually make sure that we are very focused on the issues that are happening around the world with regard to militarism. To talk about climate change and sovereignty and activism, particularly from a place like Guåhan, means to really address and grapple with the global and local scales of militarism in the Mariana Islands. This is a map from, I think, about 2015, and it's a resource online that charts where we kind of know about the bases around the world. And this is just kind of a focus mostly on US bases. And if you can see some of this, it's sort of an inundation of dots all over the map, which demonstrates just the scope and scale of global military presence. You zoom in a little bit more into an area of the Northern Pacific, and you see that, a lot of these islands and archipelagos are not only designated with parentheses behind them to talk about how they relate to the United States, but they also are heavily militarized. And so that's one of the issues when we're talking about genuine security, to think about what does it mean to have challenges to these big narratives, these big stories that are often told that don't begin necessarily with our culture or our creation story, but actually begin with from a site of violence, from a place of militarization. And so I am going to take us through examples of activism, but again, I really just wanted to tune our attention to the largest military polluter, which is the US military. And this is just one sort of infographic about what we understand to be the exporting, I suppose, in some ways, and another way of accumulating all the different kinds of emissions from the military. And we're just talking about the US military, the US Department of Defense. It says on the bottom of this infographic that the US Department of Defense is the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world, and it's a key contributor to climate change. And so if we think about this infographic representing 1.2 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases just since the start of the global war on terror in 2001, we really have to address the root causes of contributors to climate change if we're going to think about the future and one that is a future of genuine security for islands, archipelagos, and really the collective world. So you may or may not have been to Guåhan or Guam. You may have seen or not seen it on a map. Oftentimes in my conversations, I'm situating places for peoples. And so these maps are actually pretty much the same map from different points in time, but the colorful kind of areas on the left side of the screen, it's marked in yellow. On the right side of the screen, it's marked in red. But ultimately what it's demonstrating is US occupation through militarism. These are areas that comprise about 30% of the island. And they are occupied by the US military in the form of bases, munition sites, training and testing sites. And that's just what's been mapped in over the years. But right now we're also facing major military buildups. So again, bringing those things together, the global scale of militarism around the world and the way that islands, particularly zooming in on Guåhan, are being used for Department of Defense training and testing and militarism projects for their own purposes. So I mentioned genuine security, and here on this slide, kind of to bring us back to thinking about that. International Women's Network Against Militarism uses this term genuine security that is based on justice, respect for others across boundaries, and economic planning based on local people's needs, especially the needs of women and children. And so understanding that concept as a type of way of redirecting our thinking about security. That's really important, especially with Indigenous movements in places like Okinawa. I mention that because Okinawa is the site from which peace movements have been articulating and advocating for demilitarization, and a lot of the issues happening in Guåhan now and in our archipelago, which we call Laguas Sangani. Those are actually things that are coming from places like Okinawa that have long fought through peace movements to challenge military issues. And so really, globally, it's a collective care and interrelated environment that forms this foundation of our resistance in Oceania and among these, what I would mention as interdependent archipelagos, right? To talk about the resistance and activism in Guåhan and in the Mariana Islands or Laguas Sangani means we also have to be thinking about those related movements in Okinawa as well. So from this idea of genuine security, I also wanted to bring up another kind of map, which is a poetry map. So on the right-hand side, you have a zoomed in map of our whole archipelago of the 15 islands. And on the left-hand side, we have a group called Our Commonwealth 670 that wrote this poem, "What harms one island harms the whole archipelago. There is no such thing as, quote, sacrificing one island for the sake of the whole."
So after talking about this poem, I wanted to share that community groups like Our Commonwealth 670 are one example of many of the different groups that are resisting and re-existing, right? Asserting our sovereignty. So another one of those groups is Guåhan, which is a Guåhan-based organization that honors our Chamorro women of Guåhan as our connectors or link of Mangafa, which is family, and the predecessors of Todo Inan and Mami, which is our mothers. So sustained by the kana or spirit force of our ancestors and our sacred connection to our lands and waters. One of the things that this activist group is also doing is aiming to function on our Chamorro systems and cultures to build a sustainable and prosperous future. So, promoting self-determination and the demilitarization of the island's land and environmental resources by colonial powers. That's one of the other efforts of Ihagen from Allowing Guåhan. And I'll put at the top of this slide is their Instagram handle. And I also just wanted to share this image of one of their events from this past December, where they have some of the Magahaga or our women leaders and aunties in the movement that have been sustaining efforts to challenge militarization of our environment and to really just reimagine and reassert our sovereignty on the island and throughout the world. The group I wanted to spotlight is Protect Guam Water. Their handle is on this right side and their logo as well. They're an Indigenous-led youth program advocating for Guåhan's water and land, and of course, educating about the chemicals and the toxins of U.S. military firing ranges. The slide indicates one of the issues we're up against in Guam. The U.S. military is building a massive firing range complex over our northern Guam lens aquifer, which supplies 85% of the fresh drinking water to the island. These groups and their efforts are connecting the wisdom of our ancestors, which we understand and know to be part of our collective environment. It's also illustrating genuine security that I talked about before, and oceanic ways of thinking and epistemologies as a kind of framework to challenge colonial control and also military occupation. And these are important stories because they also address how violence against the land through things like occupation and desecration are intertwined with our bodies. And that's why they're direct action campaigns, they do education and healing events, and practicing ancestral and Indigenous knowledge in these ways. And so those two groups are just some examples. There's a petition that I encourage everyone to check out. Also a little bit more background information and resisting the issues of the U.S. militarization that is threatening our water. That's a petition that is available for you to check out through Protect Guam Water. And then also these examples are important because they resist the kinds of bigger narratives that are told at all about our islands. The threats that are imposed upon our archipelago are often not known. And so in 2023, as the world continues to experience these devastating impacts of U.S. forever wars and these exponentially bloated military budgets, the groups that I'm spotlighting here are really challenging the complex and contradictory ways that material conditions of military and tourism are actually limiting a lot of our efforts for decolonization in Oceania. But it's also showing us how Indigenous perspectives are shifting the narrative and the conversation from sort of that primacy of just thinking like, U.S. territory or U.S. perspectives to instead expose the U.S. as a colonial power whose actions are destroying our environment. And so in another piece that I've written that we can talk about more later, if folks are interested, is talking about the oceanic security state, the way that seemingly delineated ocean boundaries reflect this direct contradiction between the U.S. military activities and the federal environmental protection measures. So this idea that the U.S. is creating this oceanic security state and continuously expanding its claims to water space for its national security interests, but also that impacts our land, right? So when bringing those elements together in the environment and how they're being challenged. So I'm going to take you to another site that's pretty difficult to look at, but this is a map image from Google Earth that demonstrates some of the areas that have been clear cut for the new creation of a military base in Guåhan. And, violence against the land and water are really traumas of our ancestral and environmental destruction, and they're palpable. So too is that horror of desecration. So, while the region of Oceania endures the global pandemic since 2020, the U.S., actually ramped up its space construction projects. And so these areas are actually the equivalent of 900 football fields. And this particular image is kind of along the northern coastline with the group Tahila Texan featured here in the corner. That's their logo, and one of the other groups that's really active to challenge these things. Because despite the discovery of things like ancient human remains and artifacts, the U.S. military has continued its construction of its Marine Corps base, Camp Bloss. And what we know from some of these headlines sort of stories and some of this other information that was revealed is that the military activities have desecrated at least 12 ancient human burial sites. These disturbances were not disclosed to the public for months. Transparency only came about with the island community pushing for requests through the Freedom of Information Act. And so, not surprising to those of us in the know, the military is concealing its contaminating operations that destroy our lands. We still have Superfund sites, some of the most heavily contaminated sites that are awaiting cleanup. And the military's treatment of our land as separate from us as peoples, and using the land as something for their purposes and gains to sort of justify the desecration of our ancestors, while abdicating, refusing to take responsibility for the violence that they've inflicted upon us. And so that's heavy stuff. But here's another example of folks challenging those narratives and direct action. The a community vigil and ceremony to honor our ancestors at the entrance of Camp Bloss took place through the organization Texan. In Guåhan, we actually have been denied free, prior, informed consent about much of these construction activities or routine military activities that threaten our fresh groundwater and other natural resources. And so once again, these actions from the military desecrating our cultural sites and disturbing our ancestors. And of course, it's also important to highlight and to push, to note that there is a push for ending these destructive activities and the desecration that's happening, staying connected with our islands, but also relating with our archipelagos and other sites that provide an example of archipelagic activism to help us navigate together this life under US empire and militarism, and then also thinking about indigenous cultural practices and decolonial approaches that raise voice together against militarism to demonstrate how we're fighting. And these are actions that are important to genuine security and peace, not just for our ancestors, but also for, globally our collective futures. So I'll provide some more examples of Pratehi Liteksan, one of the other the organizations in Guåhan. These are some images of some of the actions to talk about the challenges against the firing range that's threatening the areas around the northern lens aquifer. And because you might not have had a chance yet to go to these particular places, I also wanted to share another image from Liteksan itself. And so this, I believe, is much more hopeful image, but also an important one to share because it demonstrates some of the life force of the water and the land in connection. And we think that's much more an important way of telling the story of our places and the important power that we have as peoples in relation to the environment, as opposed to the destruction that we're seeing. And finally, I'll just share that, like I said, trying to make sure that we're holding space across archipelagos. And these are some images from a recent journey that I was fortunate to take to Okinawa to continue to share the issues that were happening with the base and the military buildup in Guåhan with our friends from the peace movement in Okinawa that are also dealing with water contamination, base expansion, clear cutting, and other forms of destruction. So together, these stories reconnect ourselves in our environment. They seek to understand our communities as articulating resistance to empire and militarism through archipelagic activism. And I wanted to share these place-based stories to also show how decolonial frameworks can challenge our dominant colonial conceptions of these kind of imposed spatial boundaries, right, of the Okinawan Islands, of the Mariana Islands or archipelago. And so instead of accepting that as sort of vulnerable or distant islands and territories of places like the United States, we can think about these stories, I hope, as broader stories of resistance that function within an expansive configuration. And they connect our conversations across interrelated worlds, right? And our cultural practices, our relationships with our environment, our peoples, and thinking about those as way more than just military training and testing grounds. I do represent and work a lot with Independent Guåhan, which is the last organization that I'll share. This organization is one that continues to resist as well. And it is a group that is inspired by the strength of our ancestors, thinking about the love of our ancestors and also our future generations, and using those lessons to help educate and unify everyone who calls our island home, in a way that we can build more sustainable and sovereign and prosperous independent futures. So again, I apologize that I got cut off there and left you hanging, but I hope in my time chatting about some of these different groups, we have a sense of the ways that we are all connected, and how activism and sovereignty is happening in the Mariana Islands, in Guåhan in particular, in ways that help us all see more collective, prosperous, and genuine security realized for our futures. So Sitzu Masi, I'll stop the screen share now, and hopefully we still have some time for questions.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I was particularly moved by the poem thing that you stopped on with the map, and that was great. I want to start with a couple of questions. We already have 5 or 6 questions in the chat, and then I'll move to those questions. The first question that I have is that, you know, we're celebrating, or we're noting that this is 20 years since the U.S. left Vieques military base. And I was just curious about whether you have observed that the military activities in Guam have increased in the last 20 years, almost like as if there's a connection between leaving one and focusing on the other.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. That's another connection. And I wish I had more time to share all the different ways that the group I first mentioned, International Women's Network Against Militarism, has really helped me constantly be thinking about these connections, right? Vieques and Puerto Rico has been part of that network for a long time as well. And I think what we're seeing, you know, if I could take those maps that I showed at the beginning of, you know, global militarism and these different sites, it's not surprising to me that for so long the islands in various places around the world have been sort of imagined and used for these purposes. Oftentimes it's because of the fact that there's this distinct political status relationship with the United States. So less population, not necessarily the same, or conceived as different political status means that there's not necessarily the same need to follow protocol, right? So when I was talking about the oceanic security state, I mean, the U.S. military has used Vieques, and even other islands around the world continues to leave these places abandoned after they do leave, and then it's, you know, toxic, and yet it has to be, again, reliant upon the community to navigate these U.S. laws to even make the argument that they should do their due diligence. In the first place, shouldn't have used the lands in that way, and in the second place, holding them accountable by using their own laws is very complicated, and it's very burdensome, as I'm sure many of the folks on here and folks listening in understand and know too well, right? That it is overwhelming. And so, you know, not talking about Vieques in that short time I was sharing some of the groups back home in Guåhan, but I think it's constantly on our minds. Like I said, with Okinawa, the military buildup is coming from the fought, you know, long, hard peace movement in Okinawa that's meant to be decreasing U.S. military presence in Okinawa, and yet at the same time, this structure of militarism is not decreasing, right? That we know that they're ramping up their activities. So lots more that could be said about that, but I'm glad that you brought it up. And, you know, I think what we're seeing is that until we start to really address that issue at the structural level of the military and its budgets. We're just going to continue to see different forms and variations on the same theme of desecration and destruction.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big problems with Vieques is there hasn't been an adequate cleanup either there. So I also wanted to ask you about this question of decolonization, because in our study group, we've been talking about decolonization of Puerto Rico and what it really means. And you used that phrase or the term a few times. So, one thing I found interesting was that there's a dual colonization or occupation thing happening with your island, which has to do with the US and previously Japan, and then probably other powers before that. So how hard is it to deal with that sort of dual colonization? And also, ultimately, what does colonization mean for you? I mean, are there independence movements in Guam that say, well, okay, we'll be independent, but we'll keep the military base, and so that's not really decolonization, right? I mean, is that true?
Well, we do have a very long, continuous history of colonial occupation. So some people like to tell our origin story differently than the image I showed at the beginning, where we have a creation story since time immemorial. But others often start the timeline for the Mariana Islands as something that Magellan discovered in 1521. And so Spanish occupation, then US occupation, then a brief period of Japanese occupation, and back to the US has been our story in Guåhan, and it's a little bit distinct in our northern islands. And so I think that conversation around decolonization is really, it's really quite tricky because there's been, at least in the experience, the very local experience of US occupation has been a grand story of liberation, of the US recapturing Guam from Japan and the empire of Japan in World War II. And so in very recent, my grandma's still alive, and I'll use her as an example because her experience was one of Americanization, being told that you're a US citizen after the US Congress passed their own unilateral laws. So a lot of these stories have probably overlaps with a lot of different places, but that makes the conversation around decolonization difficult because as an unincorporated territory with the United States, which is a title that the United States also gave us, just our island, Guåhan, very different experience in a lot of ways for the rest of the archipelago. So they've already created this separation between one island and the rest of the archipelago. And then because the story is so much that, you're US citizens, it's an American territory, it does require a deeper level of a sort of like relearning and restorying, that history to make sure that people understand that it is colonial, that a territory is a colony, a 21st century colony, whether we take it from the United Nations, list of non-self-governing territory designation, or we just take it from what we know as peoples that have always sustained ourselves until these occupying forces. So, that's tough. You asked about the independence movement, and I will say, Independent Guåhan is one of the more active groups that has been educating people about what does the term mean and how do we orient to that, and just really to have that baseline conversation of decolonization as a process. And we have to think not only about the critiques about, the military, but we also have to recognize, so much, as I'm sure you all know, of the U.S. military experience is one of heavy enlistment, right? So we're some of the highest enlisted per capita in the U.S. Armed Forces as Pacific Islanders, as Chamorros in particular, and that does complicate the conversation because people often do use that story of security, US security, not genuine security, but this idea that if we were to choose a different political status, then how would we be able to protect ourselves? And
I'm thinking that one of the better ways to have this conversation, and some of the things that we're trying to do, is to go back to those cultural lessons, because, you know, we sustained ourselves since our creation story, since time immemorial. It's not that we can't be modern Indigenous peoples thinking about lands and waters, and protection of our collective global environment, and using technology and using all the things, but it is a tough conversation, because the process doesn't necessarily have an imagination that's yet beyond, I think, some of the things that we're experiencing right now with this massive military buildup. I think I went a little bit off track from some of your questions,
No.
but
Well, there's so much to talk about, but I enjoyed your response, and it was illuminating. I want to get to, there's a few questions up here just so that people get a chance. So Michael asks, he wants you to tell us more about the notion of genuine security.
yeah, so I mean, I think one of the biggest things that, I mean, I pulled a few headlines as well and didn't end up showing them, but, you know, if you hear much about Guåhan right now, if you've heard anything at all, most of the conversation happening in what we even might call like the Pacific is about the need for securing the United States, or using the US security forces or apparatus to protect against China. And so that kind of a security story told over and over again, whether it's protecting China in years past, and it still continues to be a conversation, protecting against North Korea. That is not a form of security that's really rooted in anything beyond nation states, and the idea that nation states are poised and ready to fight one another. And that kind of discourse is really making peoples of these places and the places themselves part of a war game, and military exercises, you know, and it doesn't give us the kind of imaginative an important way of actually thinking, like, what if we do orient to a world where security is rooted in caring for community, and in sustaining ourselves as peoples through healing the land, healing ourselves, providing for ourselves, right? So genuine security, I think, provides that really important framework, because it is about kind of flipping back to or toward justice, respect for lands and peoples, thinking differently about the economy, and recognizing that the least of us are the ones that have the most need. So something like just 5% of the US military budget, if the US military decreased itself by 5%, now I'm thinking maybe it's only 1%, but, you know, somewhere very small percentage of the huge bloated military budget could end world hunger, right? And this was research done by some folks, and it's like, what are we doing in a world where we don't have enough? Even our own military service members don't have enough often to provide for their families. They're on food stamps. They're, you know, really struggling. And so genuine security would change that. It would give us an opportunity to, like, think, what do we actually need to have a more just and sustainable future? And what we have seen with these forever wars is not either of those things, right? So we need a new framework.
Okay, Maricruz Badia brings up a point. You know, in Puerto Rico, the independence movement has been repressed for many years. And so you've shown us some photos of people engaging in activism. Is decolonial activism or independence activism repressed by any governing authority or persecution?
I think in a lot of ways we could say yes. Maybe it's not necessarily overt. So I'll give an example, and this is one of the things that we're also trying to work towards educating more. It's like, what are the political status options? What does decolonization mean, first and foremost? And what are the political status options if the process of, you know, a plebiscite were to happen? But we also have this kind of
distraction that might contribute to people sort of just like out of sight, out of mind, or choosing to not pay attention, or not feeling comfortable getting involved in, efforts that seem like you're rocking the boat. Decolonization is a radical thing. And one of those examples is a case that has really kind of, I would say, diluted some of the energy and the momentum around the decolonization process, which was a longtime resident of Guåhan named Arnold Dave Davis, brought a lawsuit against the government of Guam, saying that if we were to have a decolonization plebiscite, that he had been harmed by not being allowed to vote in that plebiscite. So using the U.S. Constitution and civil rights and voting rights sort of laws to say that because he had moved to Guåhan and he was a U.S. citizen, that he should have the right to vote in a plebiscite, which to us is very different, right? Because a plebiscite would be about those who had not yet had the opportunity, like my grandparents' generation, and those who were living in Guåhan when it was made to be a U.S. territory without the people's consent. Those people and their future generations are the ones that have not yet exercised the inherent right to self-determination. And so that whole case kind of really, I say, diluted the energy in some ways, because it made, I think, the momentum of teaching people what decolonization means and the options for that are then kind of butt up against this person that says, like, it's harmful and their voting rights had been harmed, in particular with the U.S. framework laws, that basically that this vote would be a racist vote if they weren't allowed to participate. So that, I think, has been one way that maybe we've seen, authority asserted, and we've seen these kinds of cases do damage, unfortunately, in other places. I don't know that I would say that there was another form of repression, but I think that there is those broader narratives that we're really trying to challenge. So, for example, the other issue that is another tricky and touchy subject is the inundation of militarism on the island will bring more personnel, right? We're looking at 5,000 military personnel coming in, and the military personnel will also go to other places like Hawaii and Australia. But those personnel can come, establish residency, and vote in our local elections. And so that really is a concern that many people do have, because in the local elections, they might have a say or a way of persuading people to focus on or not focus on particular issues.
Okay, I want to apologize to Maricruz. Your name is pronounced Badia. The accent was too small. I didn't get it the first time, but one final question from my colega, Rafael Capo. How are ancestral claims to land ownership negotiated in Guam?
Yeah, and how are ancestral claims negotiated? So Pratehi Liteksan, one of the last groups I was talking about, and I was remiss because my ending slide kind of took us back to the older generation, the other generation of those family landowners. They're one group that that is really working towards access and restoration and connection among the traditional landowners where the firing range is being built. And we don't really have enough oversight in the sense of like local laws. There is a land trust. And I think that's one way that people are able to sort of reclaim land. There's been returned lands, but we're dealing with the same thing that we were kind of chatting about earlier, which is that returned lands are often, they're returned in the form that the military returns them, right? So families get them back, and then they have to do the hard work and are continuing to do the hard work of healing the land because it's been so contaminated. So, yeah, I'll shorten it there, but it's a complicated system when trying to gain access or regain access to lands that have been occupied.
Yeah, I mean, it's even more thorny in the Caribbean's case because of the lack of, existence of tribes, like with intact communities and languages. So I do actually think we have time for one more question from another colleague of mine, Monica Jimenez. And she wants to know about the Chamorro diaspora in the US and whether it's a large diaspora and how does it relate to the people back in Guam?
Yeah, I'm part of that group. That's been mostly my experience throughout my life. Most of our diasporic populations are concentrated in places like California, Washington State, Texas, Arizona. As far as Chamorros, the largest concentration of Chamorros outside of our home islands are in San Diego County and in Los Angeles County. So I think the biggest thing about the Chamorro diaspora in the US is it's been an intergenerational thing. We have folks that quite a few Chamorros that have never been home, that have, and others that have, continue to go and return, but a lot of that is difficult because of economic status and the way that the US maintains it as sort of like an international but a domestic place. So it's very expensive to fly there and things like that. I will say that we are seeing a lot of different groups. I could have done a whole presentation just on the activist groups in the diaspora, and that's really great. Some of those groups are more focused on thinking about political rights and how they can, with their residency status and citizenship status in the continental US, potentially petition their politicians and to get traction in that way. But we don't have very many recent studies that I could point you to that are really looking at the diaspora. So that's something that we would really we're hoping to get more folks, activists and community organizers in relation with, educators and folks that can do that work, because we're really lacking in, I would say, data in some ways about the diaspora. My personal sense is that it is a little bit more on the youthful generation, like the Protect Guam Water group and some of these other groups back home that are really generating a lot of buzz among the diaspora. And there's a lot of energy and excitement there around not just climate change, but of course around making an effort to learn our stories and to connect back home in different ways. So
great, and I imagine that you find ways to make connections with other Oceania diaspora. So I'm going to hand it back to Christelle so she can sign out the event. And it's been a pleasure having this conversation with you, Tiara.
Likewise, thank you all so much.
Thank you both, Tiara and Ed. This is a really wonderful conversation. I do want to let everybody know, if you're interested in learning more about the territories, Centro's Data Hub has put together a dashboard bringing together data from the US territories that they're going to be presenting in a webinar tomorrow. I'm dropping the link in the chat for everybody in case you want to register for that as well and sort of continue this conversation about how we can learn more about what's happening in the territories and build bridges of solidarity. So thanks again, everybody. We'll see you at the next event and have a great day.